TumbleWeedTales After Dark. Tonight we begin Before the Valley by Teddy M. Scott, the opening novel of the Rock Springs Saga. Long before Rock Springs became a town, there was only the Wyoming frontier, vast, unforgiving, and filled with men and women willing to risk everything for a future of their own. But this frontier holds secrets. Tonight's first 4 chapters take us back to the beginning of the Daywalkers and to Jameston Garrett, a dying man faced with an impossible choice, a choice that will save his life and ultimately change the lives of generations to come. So settle in and journey with us to the place where it all began. This is Before the Valley. Chapter 1: The Making of a Daywalker. The blood was getting worse. Jameston Garrett pressed the folded handkerchief to his mouth and held it there, waiting for the coughing to stop, the way a man waits for a storm to pass, patient. Jaw tight, eyes fixed on nothing. When it finally did, he lowered the cloth and looked at it. The red was brighter this time. That was the thing he noticed most these days. How the color kept changing. In the beginning it had been a faint pink, almost pretty if you didn't know what it meant. Now it was the red of a fresh cut, deep, vivid, honest. He folded the handkerchief over on itself, so the stain was hidden, and tucked it back into his coat pocket. The bedroom was quiet. Morning light came through the window in long, pale strips that fell across the floor and climbed the far wall. Outside, New Orleans was already awake. He could hear the distant clatter of wagon wheels on the cobblestone street below, a woman calling to someone, a dog that had something to say about it. Normal sounds. The sounds of people who were going to be alive next year. Jameston sat on the edge of the bed and let the room settle around him. He was 38 years old. He did not feel 38. He felt like something that had been left out in the weather too long, still upright, still functional, but worn down to the bone. His chest hurt the way it always hurt in the mornings. A dull pressure behind his ribs that sometimes sharpened into something that made him grip the nearest solid thing and simply wait it out. He had learned not to breathe too deeply. Deep breathing invited the cough, and the cough always had something to say. He stood slowly, walked to the wash basin on the dresser, poured water, splashed his face, and looked at himself in the small mirror hanging above it. The man looking back at him was still handsome. Strong jaw, dark eyes, a face that women had always trusted and men had generally liked. His hair had gone a little gray at the temples now. That he had expected. What he hadn't expected was how thin he'd become during the past year, how the skin beneath his eyes had turned dark and loose, how his collar now hung just a little too wide. His body was consuming itself, working from the inside out. There wasn't a physician in Louisiana who could tell him why, only that it would continue, only that it would win. He dried his face with the towel beside the basin, then stood there for a moment, both hands flat on the dresser, staring at nothing in particular. Harrison. The boy was 9 years old. He was downstairs right now, probably already at breakfast, probably already making demands on whoever was trying to serve him his eggs. Jameston loved his son the way a man loves the one thing left in the world that belongs entirely to him. His wife, Catherine, had been gone for 3 years. Fever. It had taken her in 4 days and left him standing beside a graveside in the rain, wondering what exactly he was supposed to do with the rest of his life. The answer had been simple. Take care of Harrison. That was the whole answer. That was all of it. But now his chest was full of something that was slowly killing him. Harrison was 9 years old. And every morning Jameston stood at his dresser doing the arithmetic on that problem. He never liked the answer. He straightened, squared his shoulders, then went downstairs to have breakfast with his son. The Aldridge house sat on Esplanade Avenue. It had been built to impress, and it did. 3 stories of whitewashed brick, iron lacework on every gallery. gas lamps already glowing amber in the early evening dusk. The sound of a string quartet drifted through the open doors, dissolving into the warm October air. Carriages lined the street. Men in dark coats walked up the front path, women on their arms. Jameston had almost not come. He'd stood in front of his mirror for 20 minutes debating it. In the end, he'd buttoned his coat and gone. Because staying home meant sitting in a quiet house, listening to Harrison sleep, and thinking about things he couldn't fix. At least here there was noise. At least here there were other people to look at. The interior of the Aldridge house was everything you'd expect. Tall ceilings, a chandelier throwing light in every direction, tables arranged with food and drink, the kind of crowd that knew how to be seen. Jameston moved through it the way he moved through everything these days, carefully, conserving himself, monitoring the tightness in his chest the way a sailor monitors the weather. He accepted a glass of bourbon from a passing servant and found a place near the windows where he could stand without blocking traffic and watch the room. He knew most of these people. He'd done business with the men, attended the same dinners, shaken the same hands for years. He nodded when nodded at. He smiled when smiled at. He kept his breathing shallow, his glass in his hand, and told himself he would stay for an hour, maybe two, then go home. He made it 40 minutes. Then the cough came for him. It started the way it always started, a tickle, deep and interior, like something moving inside his chest. He had about 4 seconds between that first sensation and the point where he couldn't control it anymore. He set his glass on the nearest table, turned toward the window, and brought the handkerchief to his mouth in one practiced motion. The coughing lasted nearly a minute. It bent him forward over the window ledge. One hand pressed flat against the glass for balance. The cough came in waves, racking his whole body. He kept the cloth pressed to his mouth and simply rode it out. Around him, the nearest conversations fell quiet. He could feel people watching. He didn't care. There was nothing to be done about it, except wait. When it finally passed, he straightened and breathed carefully for a moment. His eyes watered from the effort. He looked down at the handkerchief. More blood, more than yesterday. He folded the cloth quickly and slipped it back into his pocket. "That is a bad cough." The voice came from just behind his left shoulder. Jameston turned. The man standing there was black, somewhere around 40 years old, built with the kind of quiet physical authority that never needed to announce itself. He was dressed well, not showy, simply well, a dark coat, a clean collar. The look of a man who had money and didn't particularly need anyone to know it. His face was composed, direct. His eyes were calm in a way Jameston couldn't quite categorize. Not the calm of indifference, the calm of someone who already knew how this conversation was going to go. "It is," Jameston said. "How long?" Jameston studied him for a moment. There was something in the directness of the question that made him answer honestly, instead of deflecting the way he usually did. "About a year. Getting worse the last few months. The blood." It wasn't a question. "Yes." The man nodded slowly, as though Jameston had simply confirmed something he had already worked out. "My name is Sledge," he said. "I believe I may be able to help you." They found a corner of the Aldridge study that nobody was using. Sledge closed the door behind them. The noise of the party became a muffled thing on the other side of the wall. In here. It was just the two of them, a lamp burning on the desk, the faint smell of old leather, and pipe tobacco. Sledge didn't sit. He stood with his arms hanging loosely at his sides, and looked at Jameston with that same composed directness. "What the physicians have told you," he said, "is that they don't know what's wrong with you, more or less. What's wrong with you is that something is growing in your lung. Something that doesn't belong there. It will keep growing. Eventually it will take up so much space that your body can no longer function around it. That's how you'll die." He paused. "I'd say you have perhaps 18 months, possibly less." Jameston stared at him. "You're a physician." "No, Then how do you? I see things, Sledge said simply. I have always seen things. It's part of what I am, and part of what I practice. I am a voodoo practitioner, Mr. Garrett. I don't expect that to mean much to you. At least, not in the way you'd like it to mean something. But I'm telling you what I see, because I believe there's something to be done about it. Jameston was quiet for a moment. He was a practical man, a rational man. And the part of him that was both of those things wanted to dismiss this entire conversation. But the blood on the handkerchief was not something he could dismiss. The truth that he was dying, that his son would be left without a father before he was old enough to manage it, those were not things he could dismiss. What can be done about it? He asked. I know a woman, Sledge said. A woman of considerable ability. There is something she can offer you, a cure, of a kind. But I want to be clear with you before we go any further. What she offers is not a simple thing. It is not medicine, it is a change. It will cost you a significant amount of money, and it will cost you more than money. He held Jameston's gaze. I want you to understand all of that before you decide whether you want to meet her. The study was very quiet. Somewhere on the other side of the door, someone laughed at something. Tell me about the woman, Jameston said. Sledge almost smiled. Her name is Maria Laru. They went 2 nights later. Sledge came for him at 9 o'clock, and they rode together through the French Quarter in a hired carriage, moving deeper into the city until the streets narrowed and the houses pressed closer together, and the gas lamps got fewer and farther between. They stopped eventually in front of a house on a street Jameston didn't know, a 2-story structure with a courtyard behind an iron gate, jasmine growing up the fence. Candlelight in the windows on the 2nd floor. Sledge opened the gate, and Jameston followed him through the courtyard and up to the front door, which opened before either of them could knock. The woman who stood in the doorway was white, with dark hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck and eyes that were a pale, particular shade of gray. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, smooth skin, no lines around the eyes, the ease of movement that belonged to a young woman. But there was something about her that Jameston felt before he could put a name to it, a weight, a density, like she occupied more space than she should. Like being in the same room with her was the same as being in a room with something very old that was currently choosing to look young. Mr. Garrett, she said. Her voice was low and had a French current running beneath the English words. Come in, please. The interior of the house was warm and close, lit almost entirely by candles. There were shelves on every wall, crowded with things in jars and bottles, bundles of dried plants hanging from the ceiling, books stacked in no particular order on every flat surface. It smelled like herbs and something else underneath them that Jameston couldn't identify, something mineral, something old. She led them into a front room and gestured to 2 chairs. She sat across from them in a low wooden chair and folded her hands in her lap and looked at Jameston, the way Sledge had looked at him in the Aldridge study, with the calm of someone who already knew the shape of what was coming. Sledge has told me about your condition, she said, and what he told me is consistent with what I can see for myself. You are dying, Mr. Garrett. You know this. I won't waste your time pretending otherwise. She paused. What I can offer you is an end to the dying. An end to it, Jameston repeated. Yes, not a treatment, not a prolonging, an end. What I can offer you is something that will remove the sickness entirely and replace it with something that cannot be made sick. Not by disease, not by age, not by ordinary time. The candles moved in some unfelt current of air. Jameston watched her face. What are you offering me? He asked. Maria Laru looked at him for a moment before she answered. I am offering to make you what is called a Daywalker, she said. And I need you to listen carefully to what that means, because this is not something you can undo once it's done, and the terms of it are not negotiable. She talked for a long time. Jameston sat across from her, and listened. She laid it out the way a person lays out a contract, methodically, completely, without softening the parts that needed to be heard straight. A Daywalker, she told him, is a living creature, not dead. Not undead in the way people mean when they whisper about vampires at dinner parties. Living. His heart will continue to beat. He will breathe, eat, sleep. He will move through the world as a man. Because he will still be a man, only different. He will not age. From the moment of the change, the biological clock that governs every human body simply stops. The sickness in your chest will be gone. The weakness will be gone. You will be stronger than you are now, considerably stronger and faster. Your senses will sharpen beyond anything a normal human being has ever experienced. Sight, hearing, smell, all of it amplified. All of it recalibrated to something beyond the ordinary range. And then, there is the charm. Most women will feel a pull toward you, Maria said. Not every woman, there are exceptions. I'll explain those in a moment, but most women you encounter will find you compelling in a way they cannot quite account for. They'll want to trust you. They'll want to be near you. It isn't magic in the storybook sense. It's closer to an amplification of what human beings already respond to, only pushed beyond the point where they can easily resist it. What makes it work? Jameston asked. The vampire blood, she said. One drop, that's all it requires. The blood carries the immortality and the hypnotic quality, but vampire blood alone would make you something else entirely, something dangerous, dark, eventually mindless. The vampire blood has to be counteracted. She paused. This is the part that matters most. The counteraction comes from a very specific source, menstrual blood. From a virtuous woman. Jameston was quiet for a moment. Define virtuous. Maria Laru looked at him steadily. I don't mean a woman who has never experienced desire. That kind of innocence is simply ignorance. What I mean is something more specific and far more difficult. A woman who understands desire, who has felt it herself, who knows what it is to be wanted and to want, yet has chosen to abstain from the act itself, because her faith in God tells her it is not what he wants for her outside the covenant of marriage. That practiced faith, held against the pull of real desire, over real time, that is what makes her blood what it needs to be. The holiness within it is earned. It is not accidental, and her blood counteracts the vampire blood. It does, it keeps the darkness from consuming you. Without it, a Daywalker drifts, slowly, over months. The vampire nature begins to reassert itself. He doesn't die, but he becomes something worse than dead. She said it without drama, the way a physician might describe the natural progression of an illness. The dose must be taken every month, mixed with specific herbs, and taken as a tincture if the dose is missed. The drift begins. Miss enough months, and you will not recognize what looks back at you from the mirror. And the blood has to be freely given, she said, naturally given. You cannot draw it, you cannot use a needle or any instrument the moment force or a tool is introduced. The blood is no longer what it needs to be. The act of extraction violates the very quality that makes it work. It must come as it comes naturally, during her monthly cycle, willingly offered. Anything else is useless. Worse than useless, she went on. The charm, the pull women feel toward a Daywalker, carries one specific, absolute prohibition. It cannot be used to compel sex. It is forbidden. Not discouraged, forbidden. A Daywalker may use his nature to make women feel comfortable, feel trusting, feel drawn to his presence. But the moment he uses that gift to maneuver a woman into his bed, he has broken the terms of what he is. What happens if he does? Jameston asked. If he uses his charm on a woman who is not virtuous, Maria said, he gains nothing from it beyond what any ordinary man gains, the pleasure of the act. The woman walks away feeling what women have always felt. when they discover they have been lied to by a man they trusted. Used, hollow, angry at themselves for it. No different than the ordinary version of that story. Painful, but not extraordinary. She paused. Something shifted in her expression. Not much, just enough. But if he targets a virtuous married woman, she said, a woman who has kept her wedding vows in God's name and remained faithful to her husband, and he uses his charm to erode her, to work at her faith until she breaks, if he succeeds in getting her into his bed, and her vows are broken in the act, what he feels in that moment is something that has no human equivalent. Her voice remained level. A euphoria, a surge in all his abilities, temporary but complete, the feeling of a kind of power that nothing else in his experience will ever approach. She let the words settle, and the woman will carry a wound in her soul for the rest of her life. A piece of her will be missing. She will feel it every day. She will never be able to explain it to anyone. She will know only that something essential is gone. Can she be healed? Jameston asked. He asked it quietly. Yes, Maria said. A priest with specific knowledge can recite an ancient prayer and use holy water. Done correctly, she heals. The wound closes. She feels God's love again. And she becomes permanently immune to Daywalker charm. No Daywalker can touch her after that. She looked directly at him. I tell you all of this because you need to understand what this gift is capable of doing in the hands of a decent man. It is exactly what it appears to be, a second life, lived with greater strength, greater time, and the company of women who are genuinely glad to know you. In the hands of the wrong man, it becomes an instrument of profound harm. She folded her hands in her lap. I need to know that you understand both of those things equally before I agree to help you. Jameston sat with that for a long moment. The candles burned. The house was very quiet. You said there are exceptions, he said. Women who are not susceptible. Women with very high intelligence, she said. Certain women, the ones whose minds are exceptional. Analytical in a particular way. They seem to process the charm intellectually, rather than emotionally. They recognize it for what it is. And Asian women, in my experience, are almost entirely resistant. I don't have a complete explanation for either. I can only tell you what I've observed. Jameston nodded slowly. One more rule, she said. And this one concerns the future, not the present. Daywalkers should only take daywalkers as partners. The human bloodline needs to remain human. You can father children with a human woman. The biology still functions, but the children will not be daywalkers, and the mixing is not what is intended. Find your own kind if you find anyone at all. He sat quietly for a while. She waited. Sledge remained silent in the chair beside him. Finally, Jameston spoke. What does it cost? Maria Laru told him. He didn't flinch at the number. He had been wealthy long enough that large numbers no longer produced visible reactions. He simply looked at her, nodded once, and said, All right, what do we do first? First, Maria said, we find you donors. She explained the practical side of it with the same directness she had applied to everything else. He needed a reliable monthly supply of the virtuous blood, enough to make the tincture, enough to stockpile against disruption. She recommended he secure at least 3 women. Before undergoing the transformation, build the supply chain before you need it. I can help you find them, she said. I know women in this city who meet the criteria. Women who would consider such an arrangement if the compensation were appropriate and if the man asking them was someone they could trust. She looked at him. You are, from what Sledge tells me, someone women generally trust. I've been told that, Jameston said. Then you have a natural advantage here. The women I'm thinking of are married. Married as virgins, and faithful without exception to their vows. They are not women who compromise their faith, but they are also women who understand financial need. And what I'm asking them to give costs them nothing of what they are. It's a bodily function, one that occurs whether they participate in this arrangement or not. The question is simply whether they are willing to collect it and pass it on in exchange for a generous sum paid monthly. You think they'll agree? I think some will. I think the right women, decent women, practical women, will understand that this is not a violation of anything they hold sacred. That's the conversation I'll have with them. Then you'll meet them. And you'll decide together. Over the following 3 weeks, Jameston met with 5 women. 3 agreed. The first was a woman named Adeline, mid-30s, the wife of a merchant who traveled often, leaving her to manage a household on a budget that never quite stretched to the end of the month. She had warm eyes, a practical manner. She looked across the table at Jameston in a quiet tarot and said, without a great deal of ceremony, "I want to understand exactly what you're using it for," he told her. He told her all of it, what he was becoming, what the blood was for, and why it had to be hers specifically. He explained the virtuous blood, the vampire blood, and the balance between them. He explained it the same way a physician might explain a medical treatment, because, in a sense, that's exactly what it was. Adeline listened to every word. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment, then she said, "So what I have is actually good for something." "It is," Jameston said. "What you have is extraordinary." She seemed to sit with that, then she said, "The money you're describing is more than my husband earns in 3 months. I know, and all I have to do is collect it naturally, seal it in the jar I'll provide, pass it to me each month. That's all." She studied him for a long moment. Then she reached her hand across the table. Jameston took it. The second was a woman named Marguerite, a schoolteacher, quieter, more deliberate than Adeline. She asked more questions, most of them theological. Did this violate anything? Was she participating in something against God's will? Maria Laru, who was present for the meeting, addressed every question with patience and precision. In the end, Marguerite said she needed to pray about it. She would send word in a week. Her answer came 3 days later. Yes. The third woman was named Claire, younger than the others. She was only 26 years old. She was supporting a sick mother on her husband's modest income. She listened to the entire arrangement with her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes were clear, direct. When Jameston had finished, she asked, "You're a good man, aren't you?" He said he tried to be. "I'll do it," she said, "but I want you to know it's not only the money. I want to know that it's doing something real, something that matters." "It keeps me alive," Jameston said, "and I have a 9-year-old son." Claire nodded once. "Then it matters," she said. He began collecting immediately. Maria provided the preservation method, a cold storage technique using specific compounds that kept the blood viable through the months. During the first 2 months before the transformation, Jameston built a stockpile, enough to carry him through 6 months. If one of the donors became unable to provide, Maria examined the supply, then pronounced it sufficient. "You're ready," she told him. Jameston stood in her candle-lit front room. He looked at the woman who appeared to be in her 30s, yet was something far older. Then he thought about Harrison, asleep in the house on Esplanade Avenue, 9 years old, already difficult, already belonging entirely to him. "Yes," he said, "I'm ready." He told himself that he was doing this for his son. He told himself that for a long time. Chapter 2: A Father's Fatal Choice. Maria Laru did not perform the ritual in her front room. She took Jameston through the house and out a rear door into the courtyard behind it, where jasmine climbed thick along the fence. Above the city, the October night was the color of a bruise, dark purple around the edges, fading to an orange-black glow where the gas lamps pushed against the darkness. At the center of the courtyard stood a low, flat stone table. Jameston suspected it had been used for this very purpose more times than he cared to imagine. 3 candles burned in iron holders around it, arranged in a perfect triangle. The flames never flickered. A light breeze stirred the jasmine, yet the candles remained perfectly still. Jameston noticed that, and quietly filed it away. Sledge was already there, standing off to one side with his hands folded in front of him. He nodded once as Jameston entered, nothing more. It was simply an acknowledgement. His expression carried the quiet seriousness of a man attending important business, and Jameston appreciated that. Nothing about the scene felt theatrical. There was only the courtyard, the candles, the stone table, and Maria Larue carefully arranging her supplies across a cloth spread over one end of the table. Jameston watched. There were small clay jars sealed with fitted lids, bundles of dried herbs tied with black thread. Each bundle was different, and none of the plants were familiar to him. There was an old, flat-bottomed bowl made of dark clay, and there was a small glass vial, no larger than his thumb. It contained something almost black. His eyes lingered on it longer than he intended. "The vampire blood," Maria said without looking up. "You don't want to handle it." "Don't touch the vial." "I wasn't planning to." She finally looked at him. "Good." She worked with calm precision. One clay jar after another was opened in a specific order. Measured portions of herbs were added to the bowl. As she worked, she spoke quietly. Not to Jameston, not to Sledge, not to anything he could see. The words rose and fell in a steady rhythm, spoken in a language he did not recognize. Jameston stood with his hands at his sides and let her continue. When the herbs were measured, Maria reached for the preservation jar containing Adeline's most recent donation. They had agreed it would be hers, the first donor. The woman who had placed her hand across the terroom table without hesitation. Maria opened the jar. Using a small glass pipette, she measured exactly 1 ounce into the bowl. Only then did she reach for the vial of vampire blood. She held it at eye level for a long moment. "1 drop," she said, looking at Jameston. "Not because more would make it stronger. Because more would make it something else entirely." She removed the glass stopper. Carefully, she tilted the vial. 1 dark drop fell into the bowl. It spread instantly through the mixture, like ink blooming across water. Dark threads reached outward in every direction before slowly disappearing, until the entire mixture became one deep color. Not red, not black, something between them. Maria sealed the vial and set it aside. She stirred the mixture slowly with a glass rod, 1 full minute. All the while she continued whispering in that same rhythmic language. Finally she set the rod down. "Sit on the table," she said. "On the edge, take off your coat, and your shirt." Jameston obeyed. The October air felt cool against his skin. His chest was thinner than it should have been. His ribs showed along both sides, the unmistakable mark of a body slowly wasting away. He sat on the edge of the stone table and watched the motionless candle flames. Maria carried the bowl to him. "You drink all of it," she said. "You do not stop no matter what you feel while you're drinking. You do not set it down. You do not pause. When it's empty, hand it back to me. Then lie flat on the table, whatever happens. You stay on the table, do you understand?" "Yes." "It will be painful." She offered no apology, only a fact. "I understand." She held out the bowl. He accepted it with both hands. It was warm. He smelled the herbs first. Beneath them was something else, something with no true scent at all. It reached deep into his sinuses and made his eyes water, like standing too close to the mouth of a forge. He lifted the bowl and drank. The taste was wrong in ways he couldn't separate. Bitter herbs, iron, and beneath both of them an unexpected sweetness that was somehow worse than the bitterness. He kept drinking. His eyes remained fixed on the far wall of the courtyard. He swallowed steadily, never stopping. The change began before the bowl was half empty. At first it wasn't pain, it was heat. It spread from the center of his chest in every direction at once. Down into his stomach, up into his throat, out through both arms, all the way to his fingertips. He kept drinking. The heat intensified. By the time the bowl was 3/4 empty, it reached his lungs. Then it found the place where the disease lived. That was when the pain began. It was complete, absolute. It felt as though the inside of his chest was rebuilding itself. In truth, that was exactly what was happening. He finished every drop. Without looking at Maria, he placed the empty bowl into her waiting hands. Then he lay back on the stone table and stared into the orange-black sky. A moment later, it became much worse. The pain exploded through his entire body. His joints, his muscles, his spine, even the bones of his skull. He did not scream. He gripped the edges of the stone table with both hands until his knuckles whitened. His teeth remained clenched. He stared upward. He breathed whenever he could, but he never screamed. Sledge stepped into the edge of his vision. He stood close, never touching him, simply remaining there. The candles continued to burn. Maria's voice never faltered. That quiet, rhythmic language became the only steady thing in the world. Then time disappeared. He wasn't unconscious. He knew the difference. He remained aware through every second. Yet time became strangely elastic. Minutes stretched into hours. Hours collapsed into moments. Later, he would never have been able to say whether he had lain there for 30 minutes. Or 3 hours. It felt like both. It felt like neither. Then, without warning, the pain ended, not gradually, not in stages. It stopped the way a sound stops. Present one instant, gone the next. Jameston remained on the stone table, breathing. He drew in one deep breath, then another. For the first time in a year, he did not measure the air before taking it. He did not brace himself for the cough. He simply breathed. The air flowed in. The air flowed out. Nothing blocked it. Nothing resisted it. He lay there for a long time, doing nothing more than that. He sat up. The movement was easy, not the careful, measured movement of a sick man negotiating his own body. Just movement, simple, direct. The way it had been 10 years earlier, before any of this had begun. He swung his legs over the side of the stone table and looked down at his hands. They were perfectly steady. They had not been completely steady in 6 months. He looked up at Maria. She stood on the opposite side of the table with her arms crossed, her expression calm and unreadable. Sledge remained where he had been all along, a little to the left, watching quietly. "How do you feel?" Maria asked. Jameston considered the question before answering. "I feel," he said slowly, "like I used to feel before." Maria gave a slight shake of her head. "No, better than that. You just don't have anything to compare it to yet." Give it a day. She was right. By the following morning, the comparisons were impossible to ignore. The difference between the man he had been and the man he had become was staggering. He stood alone in his bedroom. He moved. He breathed. He took stock of himself. The pain was gone, not managed, not suppressed. Gone, as though it had never existed. The weakness was gone. He could feel strength throughout his body, not simply returning, but waiting to be tested. His chest was completely clear. He filled his lungs to their fullest, held the air, released it slowly, and felt nothing except the simple act of breathing. His hands no longer trembled. His eyesight, which had been fading so gradually that he had blamed exhaustion, was suddenly astonishingly sharp. The room itself seemed different. Edges were crisper, colors richer. Details stood out from surprising distances. He walked to the bedroom window. Without effort, he read the name painted on a shop sign 2 blocks away. Then he crossed the room to the mirror. The man staring back at him was still 38 years old. He had not become younger. Nor had he become someone unrecognizable. It was still his face. The same dark eyes, but the pallor was gone. The dark circles beneath his eyes had vanished. The gauntness had disappeared. He looked the way he had looked at 30, perhaps even 28, healthy, strong, alive. The face of a man no longer being consumed from the inside. He dressed, put on his coat, and walked downstairs. Harrison was already eating breakfast. The boy glanced up as his father entered, then returned his attention to his plate. He was a small, round-faced child with his mother's coloring and very little natural grace. He attacked a plate of eggs and biscuits with the complete concentration only a hungry 9-year-old could manage. Jameston poured himself a cup of coffee. Then he looked across the table at his son. Beneath everything else, beneath the relief, the amazement, and the gratitude, was the simple truth that had driven him from the very beginning. He was not going to leave this boy alone. "You look different," Harrison said without looking up. "Different how?" The boy glanced at him again. "I don't know, just different." He returned to his eggs. "You're not coughing." "No," Jameston said, "I'm not." Harrison thought about that for a moment. "Did you go to a doctor?" Jameston smiled faintly. "Something like that." The boy nodded, apparently satisfied. Then he finished his breakfast. The charm, when he first became aware of it, was subtle. So subtle, in fact, that he almost missed it. It wasn't something he could see. It wasn't something he could point to in a mirror or demonstrate in any controlled way. It was more like the feeling that a room's temperature had changed the moment he entered it. Something shifted. Something adjusted. Women who had always liked him more. Women who had never met him came to trust him much faster than they should have. By ordinary standards, it made no sense. 2 weeks after the ritual, he attended a dinner hosted by the Aldridge family. There he met a woman for the first time. Within 20 minutes of being introduced, she found herself telling him about difficulties in her marriage, things she had never shared with her closest friend. When the conversation ended, she seemed faintly surprised that she had said so much. Jameston made it easy for her not to feel embarrassed. He was careful from the very beginning. He had listened to everything Maria Laru had told him. He believed every word. More importantly, he understood it. A man who has genuinely respected women his entire life understands one simple rule. You do not use people who trust you. It wasn't a complicated principle. He had built his entire social life around it long before a supernatural prohibition ever existed. Within 2 months of the transformation, the donor women knew what he had become. He told each of them himself, one at a time, quietly, plainly, the same way he had told them everything else. He owed them that much. They were giving him the thing that kept him alive. They deserved to know what he was, why he needed their help, and exactly what the arrangement meant. Adeline accepted the news with her usual practicality. "So you'll be around for a while," she said. "A long while," she nodded once. "Good. That means the arrangement is stable." Marguerite had questions, quite a few of them. Jameston answered each one as honestly and completely as he could. When he finished, she considered everything for a moment. "I find it theologically interesting," she said, "more interesting than troubling." It was exactly the sort of thing Marguerite would say. Claire reacted differently. She simply looked at him for a long time. Then she asked one question. "Does it still feel like it's doing something real?" "It does," she nodded. "Then we keep going." And they did. Over the years, Jameston expanded the donor circle with great care. The same standards, the same honesty, the same genuine respect for every woman involved. When Adeline's husband lost his business during a difficult season, Jameston quietly provided enough money to stabilize the family. He never made a spectacle of it. When Marguerite's school lost its lease, he found another building. Then he helped negotiate favorable terms. When Claire's mother finally died after 2 long years of illness, Jameston stood beside her at the graveside. One of only 6 people there. He stayed with her until the service was over. As the years passed, the women became far more than donors. Some of them walked through genuinely difficult seasons of life. Jameston helped when he could, not because they supplied what he needed, Though that certainly mattered. He helped because they had become people he genuinely cared about. The affection had grown naturally. Honestly, he wasn't performing kindness. He wasn't maintaining some elaborate strategy. He was simply a man with considerable resources and a very long life, trying to do right by people he loved. Sometimes, during the hardest seasons of their marriages, one of the women would stay for a while in the east wing of his house. He gave her a comfortable room, a key, and a standing invitation to dinner. He never asked for anything more. Some evenings they would sit together beside the fire in the parlor. Other nights they would sit out on the gallery when the weather was pleasant. They talked about marriage, about children, about faith, about disappointment, about the quiet fears people rarely admit out loud. Jameston listened. He was good at listening. He possessed the kind of patience that only comes from knowing time is no longer scarce. He spent that patience freely on people who needed someone willing to listen. As he had told Maria Laru from the very beginning, his interest in sex was almost non-existent. Catherine had been his wife for 11 years. He had loved her completely. She had been the one person whose company never grew ordinary. When she died, something inside him quietly closed. He had no desire to force it open again. He wasn't broken. He remained warm, sociable, present, capable of joy. But the desire for another physical relationship had faded until it barely mattered. The transformation changed many things. It did not change that. His charm was real. He could feel it. He could see women leaning toward him in conversation. He knew the attraction existed. He simply had no interest in using it. Following Maria's prohibition required no effort at all. It agreed perfectly with the man he already was. He kept his home. He raised Harrison. He managed his finances carefully. Year after year, he continued building wealth the way only a man with an unusually long future could. Patiently, allowing small decisions to accumulate. Making investments that would not pay dividends in 5 years, but would pay them in 50. He was never idle, never reckless. He simply lived the second life he had been given, with the same decency he had tried to bring to the first. Only now, he no longer lived in constant pain. By every reasonable measure, he was content. Harrison was 11 years old when he first noticed the women. Not in the way boys usually notice women at 11. Not yet. What caught his attention was the way they behaved around his father. The way they drifted toward him at parties. The way they laughed a little harder at his jokes. The way they touched his arm while they spoke. The way every conversation seemed to reorganize itself around him the moment he entered a room. Harrison watched it the way a boy watches a card trick. Interested, suspicious. Certain there had to be a mechanism he wasn't seeing. By 13, he noticed something else. His father wasn't getting older. He compared Jameston to other men, the fathers of his classmates. Business associates, men at church. Those men changed, slowly, naturally. Hair turned gray, then began to thin, waistlines expanded, faces softened. The years settled into their eyes. Jameston Garrett did none of those things. He looked exactly as he had when Harrison was 9 years old. Exactly. The same face, the same hair, the same easy confidence. Harrison would look at his father, then at other men of the same age, and the difference was impossible to ignore, so he began paying closer attention. By 15, he had quietly cataloged everything he could observe. His father's unchanged appearance, the fact that he never seemed to become sick, the strange way women behaved around him. The women who sometimes stayed in the East Wing whenever their marriages fell apart. The monthly visits from Adeline, Marguerite, and Claire. The small covered jars that arrived regularly and disappeared into his father's study. He couldn't fit the pieces together. Not yet, but he knew they belonged to the same picture. By 15. He also knew something else. He was nothing like his father. He was short, not dramatically short, just enough for a teenage boy to notice, just enough for it to matter. His shoulders were narrow. His posture never seemed quite right, no matter how often he corrected it. He carried extra weight around his middle that stubbornly refused to disappear. By 16, even his hair had begun betraying him. His hairline had started creeping backward at the temples. Every morning he studied it in the mirror with the same mixture of anger and helplessness. His face bore no resemblance to Jameston's. It was broader, softer. His eyes were small and set a little too close together. His mouth naturally settled into an expression that looked vaguely irritated unless he consciously corrected it. Girls his own age did not like him. That wasn't insecurity. It was observation. He tested the theory over and over, hoping he was wrong. The results never changed. Girls drifted toward other boys. They found excuses to end conversations. They treated him with a polite distance. The sort of politeness that somehow felt worse than open rejection. Harrison wasn't stupid. He understood exactly what he was seeing. He watched his father walk into a room full of women. Then he watched himself enter the same room. The difference wasn't one of degree. It was an entirely different category. At 16, the unfairness became resentment. By 20, that resentment had hardened into something much more permanent. He didn't resent his father personally. Jameston Garrett was, by every reasonable measure, an excellent father, attentive, generous, dependable, always present. No, Harrison resented the situation itself, the unfairness of the universe. His father had inherited extraordinary looks and effortless charm. Harrison had inherited his mother's ordinary frame and nobody's remarkable face. He wasn't a kind young man. He never had been, not at 9, not at 16, certainly not at 20. He possessed an unusual talent. He could identify exactly what would hurt another person. Sometimes he used it, not with shouting, not with violence, with precision, a carefully chosen remark. A quiet embarrassment arranged at exactly the right moment. A piece of information delivered when it would do the most damage. He told himself that made him intelligent. It didn't. It was simply perception, turned into a weapon, by someone who had spent his life feeling outmatched by the world. His father understood this about him. Jameston never confronted him directly. Instead, he tried something else: patience, consistency. He modeled decency rather than preaching about it. It was admirable. Harrison had long ago decided it was also hopeless. You couldn't teach character by example. Character existed before example ever arrived. The women who visited Jameston, who stayed in the East Wing, who spent long evenings talking with him on the gallery, never truly liked Harrison. They were always polite, always courteous. They were decent women. He was their host's son. But Harrison knew the difference between genuine affection and practiced kindness. He had always known. He watched the easy warmth between those women and his father, the relaxed conversation, the effortless laughter, the quiet way every room seemed to revolve around Jameston without him ever trying to make it happen. Every time Harrison witnessed it, the resentment shifted inside him. Like a stone inside a boot, he wanted what his father had. At 25, he stopped wanting it as an impossible dream. Instead, he decided he wanted to know exactly how his father had done it. So he began asking questions. The questions started small. Harrison was 25 the first time he pushed beyond the polite edge of the subject. He chose dinner. He often chose dinner. It seemed casual. It never was. While he spoke, he watched his father's face, not for the answer itself, for the place where the real answer lived behind whatever answer he received. "You never age," Harrison said. He said it as casually as someone commenting on the weather, just an observation. Across the table, Jameston continued eating. He didn't look up immediately. Harrison noticed that. "What makes you say that?" "Because you don't." Harrison held his father's gaze. "You look exactly the same as you did when I was 9 years old. I've been watching it for years. The men you do business with are old now. You look like their son." Jameston quietly laid down his fork. He looked directly at Harrison. It was the same calm expression Harrison had spent years trying to decipher. Present, steady, giving away nothing. "You're observant," Jameston said. "I've always been observant." "I know," Jameston picked up his fork again. "Some men age well. That's not what this is." There was a brief silence. Finally Jameston nodded. "No. It's not." "Then what is it?" Jameston looked across the table at his son for a long moment. "It's something I'll explain when the time is right. I'm 25. I know how old you are, Harrison." "Then when is the time right?" Jameston considered the question carefully. "When I'm confident you're ready for what the explanation requires of you." He paused. "It's not a small thing. It's not something I'll explain over dinner and expect you to sleep on it afterward." Harrison held his father's eyes for another moment. Then he looked back down at his plate. He wasn't satisfied. He never accepted partial answers. But he possessed enough self-control to recognize when pushing harder would cost him more than waiting. So, he waited, not patiently, but he waited. Over the next 5 years, the questions became sharper. The conversations became longer. Jameston answered some things. Other things he simply refused to discuss. Harrison assembled the truth the same way he always assembled anything complicated. One piece at a time. One conclusion resting on another. Inference built upon inference. Slowly the outline became visible, even while many of the details remained hidden. He knew his father was no longer entirely human. He knew it somehow involved the women, the monthly jars, and Maria Laru. He had overheard her name once. Later, he managed to corner Sledge at a social gathering and keep him talking much longer than Sledge had clearly intended. The conversation yielded very little, but even very little was something. He knew whatever had happened explained why his father never became sick, never seemed weaker, never appeared to grow older. Jameston Garrett remained exactly what he had always appeared to be, and Harrison knew something else. He wanted it. By the age of 30. He had stopped pretending it was simple curiosity. He began saying exactly what he meant. It was an autumn evening. The gallery doors stood open, letting the cool air drift through the house. Below them, the city settled into its familiar evening sounds. Jameston sat quietly with a glass of bourbon. Harrison pulled his chair around until he was facing his father directly. It was a deliberate movement, a statement of intent. He sat down. "Tell me," Jameston looked at him. "I'm 30 years old," Harrison continued. "I've been watching, waiting, asking careful questions for 15 years. I'm done with careful questions. Tell me what you are, and tell me what it would take for me to become the same." Jameston looked at his son for a long time. Harrison held the silence. He had taught himself how to do that years ago. Most people eventually filled silence with the very thing they were trying not to say. If you waited long enough, you rarely had to ask twice. But Jameston was not most people. His silence wasn't hesitation. It wasn't a man searching for the courage to speak. It was the silence of someone making a genuine decision. Finally, he nodded. "All right." He said it the way a man speaks after carrying a particular burden for many years, and deciding it was finally time to set it down, not with resignation, simply with acceptance. Then he told Harrison everything. He explained it exactly as Maria Laru had explained it to him, methodically, completely. He softened nothing. He spoke of Sledge, the Aldridge dinner party, the coughing, Maria Laru, what she was, what she had offered him. He explained what a Daywalker truly was, the ingredients, the ritual, the rules, the prohibitions, the consequences of breaking them. He explained the requirement for virtuous blood, why it mattered, what it represented. Then he described the corruption. What happened when a Daywalker ignored the rules, what the woman experienced, what it cost her, and while he spoke, He watched Harrison's face. His son's expression never became what Jameston hoped it would. A decent man, hearing that explanation, would have recoiled, perhaps only slightly, but there would be something: sympathy, disgust, recognition of the terrible harm involved. Jameston had spent a lifetime studying faces. He knew what people revealed without realizing it. What he saw in Harrison was something entirely different. As he described the euphoric high, the surge of power, and the broken woman left behind, Harrison did not recoil. He became interested. The reaction was controlled, partially hidden, but unmistakably there. Jameston finished the explanation. Then he leaned back in his chair. The October evening settled quietly around them. "I want it," Harrison said. There was no hesitation, no preparation. "Take me to Maria Laru." "Not yet. I'm 30 years old, Father. What exactly are you waiting for?" Jameston answered carefully. "I'm waiting to believe you truly understand everything you've just heard. All of it, including the parts I watched you receive." That concerned me. Harrison's eyes never moved. "I understand it completely. Understanding and respecting are not the same thing." "I'll respect it." Jameston studied his son. He saw the jaw already beginning to soften, the temples where the hair would never return, the small, watchful eyes set close together. Then he tried once again to see beneath all of that, to find the thing he had always hoped was there. The part that would tell him Harrison was going to become a good man, a trustworthy man, a man capable of carrying a burden like this without becoming corrupted by it. He didn't find it. He never really had. "Still," he said, "give me more time. We'll keep talking. I need to see more from you." "All right," Harrison answered without visible frustration. The lack of frustration was itself a performance. Both of them knew it. Over the months that followed, Harrison began performing decency. Jameston watched. He knew it was a performance. Still, he kept watching, because there is always the possibility that a performance repeated long enough becomes something genuine. It never did. 10 years passed. 10 years of questions, arguments, performed kindness, pressure, retreat, then more pressure. Through it all, Jameston never aged. His son did. Harrison moved through his 30s and into his 40th year. He grew thicker, heavier, and increasingly bitter about the passage of time. Sometimes he hid it well, sometimes he didn't. At the end of those 10 years, Jameston did the thing he had suspected he would eventually do. Despite everything his better judgment had been telling him, since that first conversation on the gallery, he gave in. Jameston told himself it was because Harrison was 40. The difference between them had simply become impossible to explain. Jameston still looked 38. His son looked 50. It was becoming a logistical problem, a social problem, a practical problem. That much was true. It was one true thing, inside a far more complicated truth. The other truth was simpler and far less comfortable. He was Harrison's father. He had always been Harrison's father. He had spent 30 years raising this difficult, prickly, deeply inadequate man. 30 years of loving someone creates a bond that is not entirely logical. It survives evidence. It survives disappointment. It keeps searching for the thing it always hoped to find, even when experience suggests it may never be there. So he sent word to Maria Laru. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, alone, without sledge. She sat quietly in the parlor with her hands folded in her lap. Her pale gray eyes rested on Jameston. Without any introduction, she spoke. "You're sure?" It wasn't exactly a question. Jameston answered honestly, "No, but I'm going to do it anyway." Maria looked at him for a long moment. Then her eyes shifted past him, to Harrison. He stood near the window with his arms crossed. His face was carefully neutral. Something moved across Maria's expression. Something Jameston had never seen before. Not once. Not in all the years he had known her. Not through every conversation they had shared. It lasted only an instant, controlled, almost invisible, but Jameston had spent 60 years studying human faces. He caught it. It was grief. Not grief for him, grief for what was coming. She turned her attention back to Jameston. "I'll need 3 weeks to prepare," she spoke calmly. "He'll need to establish his donor network before we proceed, the same way you did." Jameston nodded. "I understand." "He understands the rules," Jameston answered carefully. "He knows them." He did not say he respected them. Maria Laru looked at Harrison one last time, then she rose to her feet. She smoothed her dress, picked up her bag. Jameston walked her to the front door. At the threshold, she stopped. She turned to face him. She was a small woman. He had always noticed that about her. When she spoke again, her voice was low enough that only he could hear. "I have never refused a request you've made of me." She held his eyes. "I want you to understand something. I am honoring that promise now. Not because I believe this ends well, but because it is your right to ask it." Jameston remained silent. "If this unfolds the way I believe it will," she continued, "you know where to find me." She stepped outside. Jameston stood in the doorway and watched her walk down the front path. Through the gate, into the street. He watched until she disappeared around the corner. Only then did he close the door. He returned to the parlor. Harrison was still standing at the window. He turned as his father entered. For the briefest instant, less than a heartbeat, something flashed across his face, bright, hungry, then it vanished. The careful, neutral expression returned. 3 weeks, Jameston said. 3 weeks, Harrison repeated. He nodded once, then turned back toward the window. Jameston remained standing in the doorway of his own parlor. He looked at his son. And once again, he told himself he might be wrong, that the expression he had seen all those years ago, when he explained the corruption, had not meant what he feared it meant. That 10 years of practiced decency had finally taken root, that the man standing quietly at the window was not already making a list of the women he intended to pursue. He told himself all of those things. He didn't quite believe them, but he told himself anyway. You're listening to Before the Valley by Teddy M. Scott. Want to continue the story without waiting for the next chapter? Before the Valley is available now on Amazon. Follow the story from the beginning and discover the people, the secrets, and the choices that will shape the Rock Springs Saga for generations. Look for Before the Valley by Teddy M. Scott. And if you're enjoying tonight's story, liking the stream and subscribing helps support Tumbleweed Tales and helps us bring you more stories from the Old West. And now, back to Tumbleweed Tales After Dark. Chapter 3: The Ugly Son. The first thing you noticed about Harrison Garrett was that he took up exactly the right amount of physical space, and somehow made it feel like too much. He wasn't a large child. If anything, he was slightly undersized, short for his age through most of his boyhood, with the kind of build that suggested his body had started with modest ambitions, and then committed to them fully. He was narrow through the shoulders, soft through the middle, with a persistent slump that no amount of correction ever seemed to fix for more than a few minutes. His face was broad and round, which might have been pleasant on someone else. Small, dark eyes sat a little too close together, and his mouth seemed to rest just south of neutral. Not a frown, exactly. More the expression of a man who had already decided the situation was probably beneath him, before he'd fully assessed it. None of this was what made him difficult to be around. What made him difficult was harder to define, but you felt it within 10 minutes of his company. It was the way he paid attention. Watchful. Calculating. Always slightly ahead of the conversation he was having, as though he were already deciding how the current exchange might be made useful to him. Children don't usually possess that quality. Most children live almost entirely in the moment. They're distracted by whatever is immediate and physical, not yet sophisticated enough to play the longer game. Harrison had been playing the longer game since he was 8 years old. And when a child thinks that way, before age and consequence have installed restraint, the result becomes genuinely uncomfortable to sit across from. He wasn't stupid. That was the other thing. Stupidity would have been simpler. A stupid, unpleasant boy is a manageable problem. You keep your distance, write him off, and move on. Harrison couldn't be written off. He was sharp enough to make you reconsider your first impression, sharp enough to surprise you, sharp enough to become interesting, against your better judgment, and that made everything else worse. You kept expecting intelligence to produce decency. It never did. He had been spoiled in the particular way that often follows the loss of a parent. His mother's death had left Jameston carrying a burden of guilt, and that guilt became generosity. He gave gifts. He granted permissions. He substituted possessions for the one thing he could never return. Harrison accepted every indulgence without gratitude, and quietly positioned himself for the next one. He learned early that his father's guilt was a lever. He pulled it instinctively, not with open cruelty, not even with deliberate calculation. Simply with the practiced efficiency of someone who had discovered a mechanism that worked, and saw no reason to stop using it. He wasn't kind to servants. He wasn't kind to animals. He wasn't kind to other children. His cruelty, however, was refined enough that it rarely looked like cruelty from a distance. He possessed a gift for plausible deniability. A remark that could be dismissed as innocent, if you wanted to dismiss it. A carefully arranged situation that placed someone else at a disadvantage, while still appearing to be coincidence. He never acted in anger. He did these things calmly, patiently, with the quiet satisfaction of someone solving a very small problem. His tutors found him manageable and exhausting. In roughly equal measure, he completed the work with ease. He was bright enough that lessons rarely challenged him, but he negotiated constantly, questioned authority, pressed every boundary without quite crossing into open defiance. He had an uncanny ability to discover the soft places in another person's confidence and press on them. Never hard enough to create a scene, just hard enough to produce the small deflation he was looking for. Jameston watched all of it with the uneasy mixture of love and concern that had defined his relationship with his son. Almost from the moment the boy's character began to reveal itself. He corrected him whenever he could. When correction seemed pointless, he tried to model something better, and through it all he kept hoping. With the stubborn optimism known only to fathers who have invested too much of themselves to surrender hope, that somewhere inside the boy was a version of decency that would eventually emerge. It wasn't there, or if it was, it never chose to reveal itself. At 15, Harrison discovered that girls were not going to like him. It wasn't a sudden revelation. It came incrementally, tested and retested with the thoroughness of a boy who refused to accept its conclusions. And that discovery produced in him a particular kind of rage. He carried it from that day forward, like a stone in his chest. It wasn't that he was invisible to them. Invisibility he might have managed. What he was instead was visible in exactly the wrong way. Seen, assessed, found wanting, then politely managed. He could see it happening. He had always possessed sharp eyes. The same perception that made him useful in negotiations and conversation also made him painfully aware of one very specific social moment. The instant a girl looked at him, registered what she was seeing, then quietly adjusted her expectations from possibility to courtesy. He hated that moment. He hated it with a precision and intensity he never allowed himself to show. Showing it would only confirm everything, and he still had his pride, so he smiled when the courtesy came, kept his face carefully neutral, retreated into the safety of his intelligence, and told himself these girls weren't worth his attention anyway. He never believed that. but he repeated it often enough that he became reasonably good at behaving as though he did. There was a girl named Josephine Tirode who lived 2 streets over. She was widely considered the prettiest girl in their social circle. For 2 years, Harrison watched her with the helpless concentration of a boy who knew better and couldn't stop. She had dark hair and a way of moving through a room that somehow made the room feel smaller. She was kind, not politely kind, genuinely kind, which made her far more painful to watch than a cruel girl ever could have been. She was kind to everyone, including Harrison. And her kindness toward Harrison was completely indistinguishable from the kindness she showed the butler, or the dull cousin from Baton Rouge. That told him everything he needed to know. He overheard her once. He hadn't intended to. He had stepped through the garden door at the Aldridge house during a summer party. Josephine stood on the other side of the hedge with her friend Louise. He was already through the doorway. Neither girl had heard him arrive. Their conversation was already underway. Just something about him, Josephine was saying. Even when she was about to be unkind, her voice remained pleasant. I can't explain it exactly. He's not terrible exactly. He's just unpleasant, Louise supplied. Yes, unpleasant, and I think he knows it. That somehow makes it worse. He's always watching you. Watch him. His father's so handsome, Louise said. It seems unfair. Everything skipped a generation, Josephine replied. Then she laughed. It was a warm laugh, natural, not cruel in its intention, simply honest. The kind of honesty shared privately between 2 young women who believed no one else could hear. Harrison stood silently on the other side of the hedge and heard every word. He backed through the doorway exactly as he had entered. He stood alone in the garden for a long moment. His hands hung at his sides. His face betrayed something he never would have allowed another soul to witness. Then he straightened himself, composed his expression, and returned to the party. Everything skipped a generation. He didn't speak to Josephine Tirode again that evening. Instead, he found other people to be pleasant too. And he was pleasant, with the polished efficiency he'd spent years perfecting. No one suspected anything was wrong. He thought about those 4 words for the next 3 years. By his early 20s, Harrison had found his way to the brothels. There was nothing unusual about that. An unmarried young man of means in New Orleans during the late 17th century could visit such places without attracting much notice. Harrison made no effort to hide it. There was little social penalty, not for a man, not in this city, not in this era. He frequented the better establishments because he had money, and because he told himself he preferred quality. Though quality wasn't exactly the right word for what he was seeking, what he wanted was control, a transaction he could control completely. A situation where every expectation had already been established before he entered the room, where a woman's response to him wasn't determined by who he was, but by the arrangement itself. Inside a brothel, a woman greeted him warmly because that was the agreement. She didn't study him, didn't quietly reassess him, didn't make that familiar, almost invisible adjustment every other woman in his life seemed to make. By the time he entered the room, she had already agreed to be receptive. That was what he was buying. The problem was, he knew it. He was too intelligent to lose himself in the illusion. Knowing the warmth had been purchased never removed the humiliation of needing to purchase it. So each visit brought relief, but it also brought its own peculiar misery. And still, he kept returning, because the relief was genuine, even if everything else wasn't. The women who worked in those establishments were professionals in every sense of the word. They had seen every variety of man money could place before them. They had their preferences, their private hierarchies, and their opinions of Harrison Garrett were rarely favorable. He wasn't violent. He didn't arrive drunk. He never behaved badly enough to be thrown out. He was simply In that particular way some men manage to be. Unpleasant company. There was the way he spoke to them, not openly abusive, but with an undercurrent of contempt, as though he both needed them and resented needing them. There was the way he touched them, technically adequate, emotionally absent, and afterward, there was the way he stopped looking at them altogether, the moment his purpose had been served. They simply ceased to exist. Women who made their living reading men recognized all of this almost immediately. Most understood Harrison. Within 10 minutes, from there. They adjusted accordingly. They drew straws. It wasn't merely an expression. The madam at the establishment Harrison visited most often had eventually created an actual lottery. A small, informal ritual. Whenever word arrived that Harrison Garrett would be coming, the women gathered. Someone drew the short straw. She would spend the evening with him and receive a larger share of the night's earnings. It was the madam's quiet acknowledgement that some customers demanded compensation beyond money alone. Harrison never knew about the lottery. Had he discovered it, it would have devastated him. Then almost immediately, it would have made him furious, not thoughtful, not reflective. That was the difference between Harrison and a man who might have learned something from the truth. He always returned home in much the same frame of mind, tight, private, the mood of a man who had obtained exactly what he'd wanted and discovered it wasn't enough. He would climb the stairs to his rooms, lower himself into the chair beside the window, watch the life of the street below, and think about his father. Not with anger, not exactly. What he felt was more complicated than anger. It was the slow, relentless awareness of someone who could clearly see the distance between himself and the life he desperately wanted, a distance he had no idea how to cross. Jameston Garrett moved through the world as though the world itself had been designed around him. Women drifted naturally toward him without invitation. People sought out his company. He possessed a warmth that wasn't practiced, a steadiness that required no effort, an ease that wasn't strategy. It was simply who he was, and Harrison watched it all from where he'd always stood, slightly to one side, slightly outside its reach. The unfairness of it settled inside his chest, like a bruise that never quite healed. He wanted that life. He wanted it with the fierce, consuming hunger of a man convinced he'd been denied something that should have been his. He wanted it so badly that by the age of 25 he had begun asking questions. By 30, he asked them openly, and by 40, he had stopped asking altogether. Harrison Garrett, 40 years old, he stood before the mirror in the morning light and took stock, the way a man takes stock of damage methodically without flinching. Because flinching changes nothing. The hair was the first thing anyone noticed. What had begun as a slight recession at the temples during his mid-teens had continued with the merciless consistency of nature. Nature had no interest in the feelings of its subject. The front was almost completely gone now. What remained on top was thin, present, but insufficient, the sort of hair that forced a man to decide how to arrange it, only to draw more attention to the problem. He'd abandoned those efforts years ago. Now he simply kept what remained closely cropped. It was the dignified choice. It was also the only choice left. His face had grown heavier. The roundness of youth had settled into something more permanent. Jowls had begun to form along his jaw. The skin had thickened. Those small, close-set eyes were now framed by lines that hadn't come from laughter, but from years of squinting at the world with suspicion. His mouth still rested in its familiar position. Not quite a frown, just below neutral. Only now, the expression had become permanent. It no longer passed through his face. It had become his face. He looked like a man who had spent many years disappointed by the world and had finally stopped pretending otherwise. His body had fared even worse. The softness of his youth had combined with the habits of a wealthy man who preferred schemes over exercise. The result hung comfortably over his belt. With the settled confidence of something that had long ago stopped apologizing for its existence, his shoulders remained narrow, his arms stayed thin compared to his torso. He looked like a man assembled by someone working from a description. Instead of a blueprint, he was 40 years old, and if anyone were feeling generous, they might have guessed 50. Across the city, in the house where Harrison had grown up, his father looked 38 because, biologically speaking, Jameston Garrett was still 38. Exactly as he had been on the night in Maria Larue's courtyard. 3 decades earlier, Jameston moved through New Orleans looking younger than his own son. It had gone on for so many years that most of their social circle had stopped commenting on it. Money had a way of encouraging discretion. People noticed. They always noticed. They simply never said anything. To the man they were noticing, Harrison finally looked away from the mirror. He crossed the room, sat on the edge of his bed, rested his elbows on his knees, and stared at the floor. He'd assumed that posture many times before, the posture of a man doing arithmetic. The kind of arithmetic whose answer never changes, no matter how often it's calculated. His thoughts drifted back to the previous evening. A widow named Francine had invited him to dinner. One might generously describe the invitation as social. A more honest description would have been financial. Francine was 45. Her circumstances were declining. She was quietly evaluating her options. Harrison had accepted the invitation. The meal had been good, the conversation adequate. And throughout the evening, he'd watched Francine perform the familiar balancing act of a woman determined to remain pleasant, while carefully considering the advantages of a wealthy husband. She wasn't attracted to him, he knew it. He had always known how to recognize it. It was there in the quality of her attention, present. Without engagement, she looked at his face. But in her mind, she was looking at his money. He returned home afterward, sat in his familiar chair beside the window, and watched the street below. He was tired of sitting in that chair. Tired of staring out that window. He wanted what his father had, and for the first time, he decided he was going to take it. He dressed, went downstairs, and sent a note to his father, asking if they could meet that afternoon. The meeting that afternoon was not the first of its kind. By Harrison's count, it was somewhere around the 300th. 300 conversations over 10 years. 300 times he had made his case, pressed his argument, and been refused, sometimes gently, sometimes firmly, but always refused. He had tried every approach he could imagine. He'd argued the practical side. The deception couldn't continue forever. People were asking questions. The fiction surrounding their ages required constant maintenance. And it was becoming harder to sustain. He'd argued from emotion. He was Jameston's son. He deserved what his father possessed. Keeping it from him wasn't protection. It was cruelty disguised as love. He'd argued philosophy. Who was Jameston to decide what Harrison could handle, what he deserved, what he was capable of becoming? He had tried patience. He had tried pressure. He had even tried the long silences of a man who believes every argument has already been made, and only surrender remains. For 2 long years, late in his 30s, Harrison had tried something else. He became the man his father seemed to want, or at least, he performed being that man. He was visibly kind, publicly charitable, warm toward the donor women despite the effort it required. Claire, especially, had begun to soften toward him, enough that she eventually mentioned to Jameston that Harrison seemed to be changing, exactly as Harrison had intended. He counted it as a success. It still wasn't enough. Perhaps it moved Jameston part of the way, but partway was never the destination. Today, Harrison wasn't performing. He sat across from his father in the Garrett parlor. Afternoon sunlight stretched across the wooden floor between them. He looked at the man who had raised him, the man who appeared 30 years younger than he did, Then he spoke, plainly, without introduction. I'm 40 years old. I look 50. You look the age I was when I first asked you for this. I've been asking for 10 years, and every answer has been the same. Wait. I'm done waiting. I want you to take me to Maria Laru, and I want you to do it this month. Jameston folded his hands quietly in his lap. He looked across the room at his son. Harrison. No, Harrison's voice remained calm. I've heard everything you have to say. I've heard it many times. I know your concerns. I know what you think you saw in me the night you explained the corruption mechanic. I know you believe. I'm not ready. I know you believe I won't respect the rules. You're wrong. My word is all I have to give you, and I'm giving it. Silence settled between them. The afternoon light lay in bright strips across the floor, somewhere else in the house. A clock ticked steadily. You're giving me your word, Jameston said. Yes, and I'm supposed to trust that. I'm your son, Harrison never looked away, and I'm asking you to do one thing for me. One thing. In 40 years, Jameston remained silent for a long time. He studied his son's face, the thinning hair, the heavier jaw, those small, carefully watchful eyes. Harrison returned the gaze without flinching, because now, flinching would cost him everything. There are rules, Jameston said at last. Rules I've explained to you in detail. They are not optional, and they carry consequences I've also explained. I know the rules, knowing them, and living by them. Father, Harrison's voice stayed perfectly even. I know. I will. Another silence. Jameston lowered his eyes to the floor, then looked back at his son. I'll contact Maria Laru for a single instant. Harrison fought to keep his expression unchanged. Beneath that calm face, there was no quiet gratitude, no humble appreciation. Only the sharp, bright, barely contained satisfaction of a man who had finally acquired something he intended to use. Thank you, he said. Jameston nodded once. He didn't quite look like a man who believed he'd done the right thing, because he hadn't. He had done the human thing, and that was something entirely different. He knew the difference. He did it anyway, and that was the whole of it. Maria Laru came to the house on a Wednesday morning, and Jameston brought her into the study and closed the door, and they stood facing each other with the desk between them, and she said, before he could say anything, I know why you've asked me to come. I suspected you might. Harrison. Yes. She set her bag down on the chair beside her and looked at Jameston with those pale gray eyes that had not changed in the 30 years he had known her. And the look she gave him was not unkind, but it was not comfortable either. It was the look of a person who has accurate information and is deciding how much of it to deliver. I'll say this once, she said, and then I won't say it again, because after I've said it, the decision is yours and I'll respect that. You understand? Go ahead. What you're asking me to do is a mistake, she said. Not because the transformation can't be done or won't work. It will work. Harrison is physically eligible and the ritual will hold. The mistake is not technical. She paused. The mistake is that your son is not a man who should have this. You can see that, Jameston said. It was not quite a question. I have always been able to see it. I saw it the first time you brought him to meet me. He was perhaps 12, 13. And you brought him along to one of our meetings because the usual arrangements had fallen through, and you had no one to leave him with. He sat in the corner of my front room for 2 hours while we talked, and I watched him watch us. And what I saw in that boy was not a child's normal curiosity. It was inventory. He was cataloging everything I said and everything you said and calculating its potential usefulness to him. She said this without heat, just as a fact. He has not improved with age. He has gotten better at concealing what he is, which is not the same thing as changing it. Jameston was quiet. The corruption mechanic, Maria said carefully. Has he asked about it specifically? Come back to it in any of your conversations. A pause, once or twice. And what did he say? He said he understood it was forbidden. "That's not what I asked," she said. "I asked what he said about it." The quality of the questions a person asks about a forbidden thing tells you a great deal about their intentions toward that thing. Jameston looked at her for a moment. He asked whether the feeling was as described, whether it was actually as significant as I'd made it sound, whether the woman always knew immediately or whether it was sometimes gradual. Maria Laru looked at him. "Those are not the questions of a man learning a boundary," she said. "Those are the questions of a man mapping a territory." The study was very quiet. Outside, the street sounds of New Orleans went on as they always did. "I know," Jameston said. She looked at him for a long moment. "And you're going to proceed anyway?" "He's my son." She picked up her bag. "Yes," she said. "He is." She moved toward the door and then stopped, the way she'd stopped at the threshold before. The gesture was becoming a pattern between them, this pause at the exit, this final thing. "If he does what I believe he's going to do," she said, "the harm will not be small. The women he targets will be real women with real lives and real damage. I want you to know that I will do what I can to repair what he breaks, but I can't be everywhere, and he will move faster than I can follow." "I know," Jameston said again. The two words sounded different this time, heavier. "Make sure the donor network is solid before we proceed," she said. "5 women this time, not 3. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." She opened the study door. 3 weeks, she left. Jameston stood in the study for a long time after she was gone, alone with the decision he had already made, and the full, clear-eyed knowledge of what it might cost. And told himself, the thing fathers tell themselves when they do the human thing instead of the right thing. He told himself maybe it would be different. It would not be different, but he told himself. Chapter 4: The Father's Mistake. The 3 weeks moved the way 3 weeks move when something is waiting at the end of them. Faster than you want them to and slower than they should, both at once. Jameston spent the first of those weeks working on Harrison's donor network, which was the practical requirement before anything else could happen, and which also gave him something useful to do with his hands and his mind, while the larger question sat in his chest like a stone. He'd swallowed. Finding the right women was not a simple thing. The criteria were specific, and the specificity was not negotiable. He knew this better than anyone. Had built his own network on it 30 years ago, and maintained it since with the care you maintain anything that is keeping you alive. A virtuous woman was not simply a faithful wife. She was a faithful wife who had walked into her marriage already understanding desire, who had felt the pull of it and chosen differently because of something in her that was stronger than the pull. That quality was not common, and it was not always visible from the outside, and identifying it required the kind of conversation that could not be had casually. Maria Laru helped. She had always been the one who knew which women fit and which merely appeared to, and her assessment was reliable in a way that Jameston had stopped questioning decades ago. She moved through the city's social fabric in ways that were not entirely explicable, and she came back to him at the end of the first week with 7 names. Harrison met with 5 of them. Jameston sat in on all 5 conversations, which Harrison had not expected and did not welcome, but accepted without visible objection because he was still, in these final weeks before the transformation, performing. The conversations were not comfortable to watch. Harrison had the intelligence to understand what was required of him. He knew the donor relationships needed to be built on trust, knew that these women had to feel genuinely safe with him, knew that the whole arrangement depended on their willingness, being real and freely maintained. He knew all of this, and he applied himself to projecting it, and the projection was technically competent. He was warm enough, direct enough, appropriately serious when seriousness was called for. But Jameston watched the women's faces. He had been watching women's faces in these conversations for 30 years, and he knew what genuine comfort looked like in this context, and what managed politeness looked like. And what he saw on 3 of the 5 faces was managed politeness. They were agreeable because agreeable was what the situation called for, not because they felt safe. 2 of them, a woman named Heloise and a younger woman named Paulette, were something closer to genuinely at ease with Harrison, or at least not actively uneasy. And those were the 2 Jameston noted. In the end, 5 women agreed to the arrangement. He suspected that 2 of those 5 agreements would not last past the first month after the transformation, when Harrison's charm was active and his management of it became visible. He said nothing about this to Harrison. He said it to Maria Laru quietly on the 2nd week, and she nodded as if she had already reached the same conclusion. "Make sure the supply is stockpiled before we do anything," she said. 8 weeks of reserve at minimum. Whatever happens with the donors afterward, he needs the buffer. Jameston made sure of it. The night before the ritual, Jameston sat on the gallery of his house in the October dark and drank bourbon slowly and thought about Catherine. He did this sometimes, not often, not in a way that incapacitated him, but occasionally. When something large was happening, and he felt the absence of her as a specific weight rather than a general condition. She had been gone 31 years. He still knew exactly what it had felt like to have her in a room, the particular quality of her attention, the way she laughed, the way she could look at Harrison when Harrison was being difficult, and find something in him worth loving without pretending the difficulty wasn't there. She had been better at the Harrison problem than Jameston had ever been. Better at it by nature, which meant she'd made it look effortless. Which meant he'd never had the chance to fully understand her method before she was gone, and he was left with the problem, and none of the tools she'd used on it. He wondered what she would have said about tomorrow. He had a reasonable idea. Catherine had been a practical woman and a perceptive one, and she had loved Harrison with the full force of a mother's love, which was different from a father's love in ways that were hard to articulate but real, less conditional on outcome, more capable of holding 2 things at once: the love and the clear-eyed knowledge of what you were loving. She would have known what Harrison was going to do with the transformation. She had always known what Harrison was going to do before he did it. He suspected she would have said no. He suspected she would have said it gently and without drama, and with the full weight of her understanding of what their son was, and he suspected he would have listened. But she wasn't here, and he had listened to himself instead, and himself had arrived at yes, and tomorrow was tomorrow. He heard the door behind him open and close, and Harrison came out onto the gallery and stood at the railing and looked out at the city. He was in his shirt sleeves, which made him look older somehow. Without the coat, the soft heaviness of his body was more apparent, the thickness at the waist, the narrow slope of the shoulders. He looked like what he was, a 40-year-old man whose body had been honest about its intentions since his 20s. Tomorrow he would look like something else. "You're up late," Jameston said. "Couldn't sleep." Harrison leaned on the railing with both hands and looked at the street below. "Are you having second thoughts?" "I've been having second thoughts for 10 years, Jameston said. "They haven't changed anything." Harrison glanced at him. Something crossed his face that might, in a different man, have been gratitude. In Harrison it was harder to read. It looked like gratitude on the surface, but underneath it was the look of a man checking that the thing he'd been working toward was still secured. "I'll keep the rules," Harrison said. He said it to the street, not to Jameston. "I know you know them," Jameston said, a pause. "That's not the same as saying you believe me." "No," Jameston said. "It's not." Harrison was quiet for a moment. "Then I am your son." "You are," Jameston said. "That's why we're doing this." They stood on the gallery for a while in the October night, father and son, not talking, the city going about its business below them. After a while Harrison went back inside. Jameston stayed where he was and finished his bourbon and looked at the sky and thought about Catherine. And after a time, he went inside too and went to bed and did not sleep well. Maria Larue's courtyard looked exactly as it had 30 years ago. The jasmine on the fence, the stone table at the center, the 3 candles in their iron holders, arranged in their triangle, burning without moving in the light autumn breeze. Sledge standing to one side with his hands folded, older now, heavier through the face, but with that same quality of composed attention that had not changed in 3 decades. Maria at the far end of the table with her cloth laid out and her materials arranged. And the smell, herbs and something underneath them, that mineral something that Jameston had smelled here before and nowhere else. Harrison stood just inside the courtyard door and looked at all of it. He was wearing his good coat and he had his hands in his pockets and his face was doing the neutral thing. But Jameston, standing beside him, could feel the charge coming off him, anticipation. Barely contained, the vibration of a man who has waited 20 years for a specific moment and is now standing in front of it. "Come," Maria said. She did not look up from her preparations. They crossed the courtyard. Jameston stood back. This part was between Harrison and Maria, and his role now was witness, which was perhaps the role he should have refused to play. But he was here, and it was tonight, and the decision was made. Maria went through the ritual preparation the way she'd gone through it with Jameston, methodically, without drama, each element in its sequence. The clay jars, the herbs measured and combined in the dark bowl, the preserved blood from the donor stockpile, 1 precise ounce, the pipette held steady. Jameston watched Harrison watch the vial of vampire blood when Maria produced it, and he watched Harrison's eyes go to it and stay there. "1 drop," Harrison said. He said it almost to himself. "1 drop," Maria confirmed. She did not look at him when she said it. She opened the vial and tilted it over the bowl. The drop fell. The mixture did what it always did, the dark thread spreading instantly outward, reaching the edges of the bowl, subsiding into that deep and nameless color. Harrison stared at it. Maria stoppered the vial and set it aside and picked up the stirring rod and worked the mixture in silence. Then she looked at Harrison. "Coat and shirt off," she said. "Sit on the table." Harrison removed his coat and handed it to Jameston without looking at him. He unbuttoned his shirt and folded it over the coat. Without his clothes, he was exactly what he'd appeared to be in them, soft through the middle, narrow through the shoulders. The body of a man who had not been kind to himself, and whose body had returned the favor. He sat on the edge of the stone table, and his weight settled onto it with the solidity of a man who was substantial regardless of how he felt about it. Maria brought the bowl to him. "You drink all of it without stopping," she said. "You don't put it down. When it's empty, you hand it back. Then you lie back and you stay on the table. Whatever you feel, you stay on the table." "I understand," Harrison said. "It will be painful. I know." She held the bowl out and Harrison took it in both hands and looked at it for just a moment, looked at it the way a man looks at something he has wanted for a very long time when he finally has it in his hands, and then he brought it to his mouth and drank. He drank steadily, without hesitation. Whatever the taste was doing to him, he didn't show it. He kept his eyes forward and his throat working, and he finished the bowl in one sustained effort, and handed it back to Maria with a steadiness that surprised Jameston, who had gripped the edge of his own table and barely held on. Then the mixture hit him. It was faster with Harrison than it had been with Jameston, the heat spreading visibly from the center outward, Harrison's jaw going tight, his hands going flat on the stone table on either side of him. He did not lie back. He sat upright as the first wave hit him, spine rigid, and Jameston took a step forward instinctively before Maria put a hand out without turning to stop him. "He stays on the table," she said quietly. "That's all you have to do." Harrison's body made the decision about lying down on its own. Without consulting him, his arms gave and he went back and his head hit the stone with a sound that made Jameston wince. And then he was flat on the table, and the coughing started, deep and racking. Nothing like Jameston's lung clearing, but the sound of a body in serious negotiation with itself. It lasted longer than Jameston's had, 40 minutes at least, possibly closer to an hour. Harrison did not scream either, which Jameston had not expected. He had expected Harrison to scream, would not have blamed him for it. But Harrison lay on the stone table with his teeth clenched and his hands gripping the edges, and he wrote it in silence. Whatever else was wrong with his son, there was that. When it stopped the way it had stopped for Jameston, completely, without stages. Harrison lay still for a moment. Then he sat up. The movement was different already. Not the careful negotiation of a heavy man shifting his weight on a stone surface, but something easier, something that had found a new center of gravity. He sat up and put his hands on his knees and breathed. Jameston looked at his son's face. It was the same face. The same broad jaw, the same close-set eyes, the same features that had never assembled themselves into anything that women looked at twice. The transformation did not redistribute a man's bones or redesign his face. Harrison looked like Harrison. But he looked like Harrison the way a banked fire looks like a fire, everything there, held in, waiting. "How do you feel?" Maria asked. Harrison looked up at her. His eyes were sharp in a way they hadn't been an hour ago, the same small eyes but lit differently, focused with a precision that Jameston felt rather than saw. "Different," Harrison said. He said it quietly, almost to himself, taking stock. Completely different. He stood up off the table. The movement was smooth and certain in a way his movements had never been. He stood in the courtyard and looked at his hands and turned them over and looked at them some more. And Jameston watched him discover what he was now. And the expression on Harrison's face was something Jameston had no comfortable name for. It was satisfaction, pure and complete and directed entirely inward. "Give it a day," Maria said. "You'll understand the full scope of it by morning." Harrison looked at her. Something passed between them, something Jameston caught the edge of but couldn't fully read. Then Harrison looked at Jameston. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," Jameston said. By morning, Harrison understood the full scope of it. He stood in front of his mirror, and he was the same man he had always been, and he was not the same man he had always been. And both of those things were true simultaneously, and he held them both without difficulty, because the mind that was holding them was sharper than it had been 12 hours ago. He was still short, still narrow through the shoulders, still carrying the weight he'd accumulated over 40 years around his middle. The hair situation was unchanged. His face was still his face, the broad jaw and the close-set eyes and the mouth with its default set, and none of that mattered. He could feel it, could feel the charm the way you feel a new limb, something present and functional that hadn't been there before. Something he could sense operating, even standing alone in his bedroom. A quality that had simply been added to him, layered over everything he was, changing the way he occupied the space around him without changing anything visible. He was Harrison Garrett, and he was something more than Harrison Garrett, and the something more was extraordinary. He got dressed and went downstairs. The first person he encountered was the housemaid. A woman named Doris who was in her 50s and had worked in the house for 20 years and had always treated Harrison with the specific brand of professional neutrality that longtime servants develop toward difficult employers present. Functional, entirely unexpressive of whatever she actually thought. She looked up when he came into the kitchen, and something happened to her face. Not dramatically, not in a way she would have been able to describe afterward probably. Just a small softening, a slight reorientation, as if something in the room had shifted and she was adjusting to the new arrangement. She said good morning to him, with a warmth that she had never previously deployed in 20 years of good mornings. And he felt it, felt the difference between this and every previous interaction, like the difference between a closed door and an open one. He ate breakfast alone and thought about it carefully. The charm was real, and it was operational, and it was going to work on most women. And the categories of women it would not work on were the ones Maria had described, the exceptional intellects who processed it analytically rather than emotionally, and Asian women. He filed this information the way he filed everything, accurately, without sentiment, in the category where it would be most useful. After breakfast, he dressed in his good coat and went out into the city. He walked through the French Quarter in the morning, and he paid attention to what happened around him. He was not going anywhere specific. He was conducting an experiment with the controlled precision of a man who wants accurate data before he starts making decisions. What happened was consistent and remarkable. Women looked at him. Not the polite and rapidly redirected glance of a woman registering an unimpressive man and moving on, but something sustained, something that wanted to stay. He passed a woman coming out of a shop on Royal Street who was perhaps 30, well-dressed, clearly going somewhere with purpose, and she looked at him and stopped going there for a moment. Just a moment. He kept walking and did not press it, but he felt it, felt the exact quality of the attention, the pull of it, and felt it with a clarity that told him exactly what he was working with. He walked for 2 hours and came home and sat in his study and thought. The women who had rejected him over 40 years of his life, the Josephines, the polite managers, the women who had looked at him and made their small interior adjustments before offering their courtesy, those women, or women like them, would now look at him differently. The physical facts were unchanged. But the physical facts, apparently, were not the whole of what women responded to, and the thing that had been added to those physical facts was significant enough to move the calculation. He thought about the corruption mechanic. He was careful to think about it in exactly the way that a man thinks about a prohibition he intends to honor. He told himself, clearly and in plain terms, that it was forbidden, that the cost to the woman was real, that the consequences of violating it were serious. He told himself all of this with the full articulation of a man who has studied the rule and knows it backward. And underneath that telling, in the part of his mind that did not produce words, he thought about something else. He thought about the women who had managed him, the women who had offered him the courtesy that was worse than indifference, the women who had laughed about him on the other side of a hedge, not cruelly, just honestly, in the private way of women who didn't know he was listening. He thought about Josephine Tirode. Then he put that thought in a box and closed the box and went about his day. But he knew the box was there. Jameston noticed the change in Harrison the same morning, at breakfast, before he'd had time to observe anything more specific. It wasn't a visible change. Harrison looked the same, moved the same, sat at the table the same way he always sat. But there was something in his quality of attention that had shifted. He was more contained, more settled. The low-level vibration of frustration and resentment that Jameston had spent 40 years reading in his son's baseline was absent, or at least suppressed past the point where Jameston could detect it, and the absence of it produced not the relief he might have expected, but a different kind of disquiet. A man who is angry and shows it is a man you can read. A man who has stopped showing it is a man who has found a reason not to. They ate breakfast largely in silence. Harrison was pleasant, not performatively, not with the visible effort of the managed performance of the past decade, but with something that looked more natural. Jameston watched him and tried to determine whether what he was seeing was genuine change or excellent concealment, and he couldn't fully determine it, which was itself information. After breakfast, he went to see Maria Laru. She was in her garden when he arrived, which was unusual. She was almost always inside when he visited, in the candle-lit interior that was her natural environment. But she was in the garden this morning, doing something with herbs that she set aside when he came through the gate, and she looked at him with those pale gray eyes and said, "How is he?" "I don't know," Jameston said honestly. He sat down on the bench she indicated. "He's different, calmer. The edge is gone or it's not visible. The charm is working," she said. "He knows it's working. A man who has been fighting for his whole life stops fighting when he wins. Or he stops fighting when he stops needing to," Jameston said. "Because he's found a better approach." Maria looked at him. "Yes, that too." They sat in the garden for a while. A bird was working the jasmine along the fence. The city went on behind the walls. "Watch him closely for the first year," she said. "The charm is new and he'll be testing it. The testing is not the concern. Every Daywalker tests it, you did too. It's a natural response to a new capability. The concern is what he does after the testing. Where he aims it and how. And if he goes where I think he's going to go, then we deal with it," she said. "One woman at a time if we have to. Frank Benoit is still in the city. He knows the prayer." She looked at Jameston steadily. "I meant what I said before. I will do what I can. But Harrison will move faster than repair can follow if he decides to." "I know." "Then watch him," she said again. "And don't wait too long to act when the time comes. A father's patience is an admirable quality in ordinary circumstances. In these circumstances it will cost other people." Jameston went home. Harrison was out. He didn't come home until evening, and when he did he was composed and pleasant and gave no account of where he'd been that Jameston asked for, because Jameston, standing at the threshold of the situation he had created, could not quite bring himself to begin the interrogation. Not yet, not on the second day. He told himself he would watch. He watched. For 3 months Harrison kept the rules. Jameston could see him doing it, could see the active management of it, the deliberate restraint. The way he moved through social situations with his new capability operating, and stopped short of where the rules said to stop. He was using the charm freely, in the sense that he was not suppressing it. It was operational in every room he entered, and women responded to it. And he let them respond without pushing the response into territory that was forbidden. He went home with women. More women than he had ever gone home with in 40 years of his prior life. Women who would have managed him into courtesy 18 months ago, and now managed themselves into his bed instead. And none of that violated anything Maria Laru had prohibited. He seemed to enjoy this enormously. There was a quality to him in those first 3 months that Jameston had never seen before, something approaching lightness. Almost cheerful in the way that a man who has been in pain for a very long time is cheerful when the pain stops. He had wanted this his whole life, and having it was, apparently, as satisfying as he had imagined. For 3 months he seemed genuinely content with the ordinary version of it. Jameston watched this and let himself, carefully and with reservation, begin to hope. He should not have. The 4th month Harrison found Josephine Tirode. She was 43 now, married for 20 years to a man named Gustave Renard, 3 children, living in a house on Esplanade Avenue 4 streets from where she'd grown up. She was still beautiful in the way that some women are still beautiful at 43, not despite their age but with it. The beauty matured into something more interesting than it had been at 20. She was still kind in the genuine way, not the managed courtesy kind. Still the woman who was warm to everyone, including the butler and the dull cousin from Baton Rouge. And she was, Jameston would later confirm through channels that cost him considerable grief, exactly what the criteria described. Married as a virgin to Gustave Renard, faithful in 20 years of marriage without exception. Her faith in God the organizing principle of her life in a way that was not performed and not occasional. She was, in the precise technical sense, virtuous. Harrison had found her. Jameston did not know this yet. He would not know it for 6 weeks, by which time the damage would be done. What he knew at the end of the 3rd month was that Harrison had stopped being home in the evenings with the frequency he'd established in the first weeks, and that when he was home, he had acquired a quality of focused, private satisfaction that was different from the lighter contentment of the previous months. Something specific, something aimed. Jameston stood at his study window one evening and watched Harrison come through the gate below and cross the courtyard to the door. And even from that distance, and in the fading evening light, he could read it in his son's walk. The walk of a man who knows where he is going and has already decided he's going to get there. He went to see Maria LaRue the next morning. She already knew. "How far along?" Jameston asked. "Close," she said. "He's been at her for 6 weeks. Careful, patient, he's doing it properly, which is the worst way for him to do it, because a blunt approach she could have identified and refused. He's been working at it in layers. Becoming a friend, becoming someone she trusts, building the thing that makes the next step possible. We have to stop it. I can go to her," Maria said. "I can try to warn her." But warning a woman against a man she already trusts is a complicated conversation, and if Harrison has done his work well, she'll interpret the warning as an attack on a friend. She paused. The only guaranteed way to stop it is to stop him, directly. Jameston thought about the conversation that would be. He thought about 40 years of Harrison, and the 10 years of begging, and the performance, and the night on the gallery when Harrison had said, "I will keep the rules," and said it to the street. Not to him. "I'll talk to him tonight," he said. He talked to him that night. Harrison listened to everything Jameston said with the patient, attentive expression of a man hearing out a position he has already decided not to be moved by. He did not deny that he knew Josephine Renard. He did not deny that he had developed a friendship with her. He denied calmly, directly, with a steadiness that would have been convincing from anyone else, that he intended to take it further. "She's a married woman," Harrison said. "I know what she is. I know what the rule is. I'm not an idiot, father." "I know you're not an idiot," Jameston said. "I'm asking you to tell me plainly that you're not going to do what I think you're planning to do. I'm telling you plainly. Look at me when you say it." Harrison looked at him. His eyes were steady and clear and gave nothing away. "I'm not going to touch Josephine Renard," he said. "I give you my word." Jameston looked at his son for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." He went to bed that night knowing it was not all right, knowing the word that had been given was the same word that had always been given. Worth exactly what it had always been worth. 3 weeks later, Josephine Renard went to Harrison Garrett's house for dinner and did not come home until the following morning. And the thing that happened in between was the thing Jameston had known was coming from the night in the parlor, when he'd watched his son's face receive the description of it, and seen interest instead of recoil. It had happened. The only question now was what came after. Thank you for spending part of your evening with us, here on Tumbleweed Tales After Dark. Tonight, you heard the first 4 chapters of Before the Valley by Teddy M. Scott. But the story is only beginning. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, please take a moment to like the stream and subscribe to Tumbleweed Tales. Your support helps this channel grow and helps us bring you more stories from the Old West. Join us again for more gunfighters, outlaws, mysteries, and strange tales from beyond the frontier. Until next time, keep your fire burning and don't be too certain about what you hear out there in the dark. Good night from Tumbleweed Tales.